The night has a way of hiding secrets. Beneath the city streets, in the shadows of forgotten places, creatures and mysteries lurk where no one dares to go. Tonight, we follow those brave, or perhaps foolish enough to face the dark. Welcome to Midnight Delight, where the unknown is waiting just around the corner, and every call might just be their last. Brace yourself for nightmare service calls, because some problems can't be fixed, and in the depths, something far worse is watching. It was just past midnight when I got the call. The dispatcher's voice was crackling through my radio, telling me there was a power outage at one of the remote stations deep in the woods. It wasn't unusual for the generators out there to fail. Old equipment, weather, maybe even some wildlife messing with the wires. My partner for the night was Dave. Solid guy, older than me, had been in the field longer too. He wasn't the talkative type, which was fine by me. We loaded up the truck with our tools and gear, and by 1 a.m. we were driving down a narrow, unmarked road that led to the power station. It was one of those places that nobody really thinks about unless it stops working. The kind of facility hidden away in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick trees that swallowed any sign of civilization. As we got closer, Dave broke the silence. "You ever worked out here before?" he asked, his eyes focused on the dark road ahead. "Nah, this is my first time," I replied, watching the tall trees rush past. "But I've heard stories. Some of the guys say weird stuff happens out here." Dave snorted. "Psh, that's just talk. Guys like to make things sound spookier than they are. The place is creepy, sure, but it's just a generator. Nothing we can't handle." I didn't say anything back, but the knot in my stomach tightened. Maybe it was just nerves, or maybe it was the way the moonlight barely touched the trees. Something didn't feel right, but I shrugged it off. We were just here to fix a power outage. When we finally pulled up to the facility, the first thing I noticed was the silence. You don't realize how loud the world is until you're in a place like that. No wind, no rustling leaves, no animals, just silence. It was kind of unsettling. The building itself was small, just a concrete structure with a few control panels and the generator behind it. The lights were flickering, casting strange patterns on the ground. "We better get this done quick," Dave muttered, grabbing his flashlight and heading towards the generator. I followed him, shining my light around the area. It was weird. The shadows looked like they were moving, almost like they were alive. But every time I focused on one, it was gone. Probably just my eyes playing tricks on me, I thought. We reached the generator and Dave knelt down to inspect it. "Looks like the fuse blew," he said. "Simple fix." As he worked on it, I stood up, shining my light around. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing straight up. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept hearing faint shuffling sounds, like footsteps, but when I looked, there was nothing. "You hear that?" I asked. Dave glanced up at me, frowning. "Hear what?" "Footsteps. I swear I keep hearing something moving around out there." He paused for a second, listening, and then shook his head. "You're just spooked. It's the woods, man. There's animals out here. They're probably just watching us." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't argue. Still, I kept my flashlight moving, scanning the tree line, the building, the flickering lights. And that's when I saw something. A shadow darted between the trees, too fast to be an animal, too large to be anything normal. "There!" I shouted, pointing my light. Dave stood up, looking in the direction I was pointing. "What?" "I saw something, over there by the trees." Dave sighed, clearly irritated. "You're seeing things, man. Just shadows. The lights are flickering and it's messing with your head." But I wasn't so sure. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd seen wasn't just a trick of the light. Suddenly, the generator roared back to life, and the lights around the facility steadied, casting a brighter glow over everything. For a moment, I felt relieved, but then they came. From the corners of the facility just beyond the reach of the light, the shadows began to move. Not normal shadows, the kind that shift when you move a light source. These were different. They seemed to have form, substance. They slithered and crawled, staying just at the edge of the light, like they were afraid to come closer. "Dave," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Look." He turned and froze. The shadows were creeping closer, inch by inch, like they were waiting for something. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, taking a step toward the building. "I don't know," I replied, my hand shaking. "We need to go." But before we could move, the lights flickered again, just for a second. And in that second, they lunged. Dark, twisting figures shot forward, reaching for us with elongated limbs made of pure darkness. I barely had time to react before one of them was on me, its icy, shadowy form wrapping around my leg. I screamed, kicking it off, stumbling backward into the building. Dave wasn't so lucky. One of the creatures grabbed him, pulling him down into the darkness. His flashlight hit the ground, the beam dancing wildly across the concrete as he fought against it. "Help me!" he shouted, his voice desperate, terrified. I ran to him, swinging my flashlight at the creature. As soon as the beam hit it, the thing recoiled, shrieking back into the shadows. But more were coming. They swarmed around us, moving like smoke, darting between the beams of light. "We need to get inside," I shouted, dragging Dave to its feet. We stumbled toward the building, barely making it inside before the lights flickered again. The door slammed shut behind us, and for a moment, everything was quiet. The shadows couldn't follow us in. Not yet. The lights inside were still holding. Dave was breathing heavily, his face pale, his hands shaking. "What the hell were those things?" "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "But they're out there, waiting for the lights to go out." We stood there in the flickering light, listening to the hum of the generator outside. Every time the lights dimmed, I could hear them, scratching at the walls, tapping on the windows, waiting for their chance to get inside. "We can't stay here," I said. "The generator's not stable. If it shuts off..." Dave nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "Yeah, we're dead." We had to think fast. There was a backup generator in the basement, but getting there meant going through the shadows. There were no windows in the basement, no lights, just pure darkness. But it was our only option. "Grab your flashlight," I said, my voice shaking. "We have to move." Together we made our way down the narrow staircase, darkness closing in around us. I could hear the shadows following us, creeping closer with every step. My flashlight flickered and I cursed under my breath. It was dying. "Keep it together," Dave whispered, his voice trembling. "We can do this." We reached the basement, and that's when it happened. The lights upstairs went out, plunging us into complete darkness. My heart stopped as the shadows swarmed in. I could feel them all around me, cold and hungry, pressing in from every direction. "Get to the generator," Dave shouted, his voice barely audible over the sound of the shadows moving, their whispers filling the air. I fumbled for the generator switch, my hand shaking uncontrollably. The shadows were on us, their icy fingers brushing up against my skin, pulling me into darkness. But I found the switch, and with a desperate cry I flipped it. The generator roared to life and the lights blazed on. The shadows screamed, recoiling, disappearing into the corners of the room. For a moment, everything was still. "We did it," Dave gasped, slumping against the wall. But I knew better. The generator was old, and the fuel gauge was nearly empty. We only had a few minutes before it would run out again. "We need to get out of here," I said, grabbing Dave by the arm. We raced up the stairs and out of the building, the shadows lurking just behind us, waiting for the lights to die. As we reached the truck, the generator sputtered and went silent. The shadows surged forward, but we were already peeling out of the parking lot, racing down the dark road. Neither of us spoke the entire drive back to the main plant. We didn't need to. We both know what we'd seen, what was still out there, waiting in the dark, and we both knew we were lucky to be alive. To this day, I can't go near that part of the woods. I can't handle the dark the way I used to, because now I know what's out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the lights to go out. And if you ever find yourself working the night shift out in the middle of nowhere, pray that the lights stay on. It was just another late night shift, or at least that's what I thought. My name's Gary, and I've been working as a sewer maintenance worker for quite some time now. I've seen all sorts of weird stuff down here. Rats the size of cats, strange liquids that bubble up from who knows where. But I bet you won't believe what I'm about to tell you. And that's okay, because it doesn't make it any less real. It was a Tuesday night. My partner Carl and I were scheduled to check on some reports of flooding in the downtown sewers. Routine stuff, honestly. Usually it's just a clogged drain or a buildup of debris that we clear out. But as soon as we descended the manhole that night, something felt off. The air was different, heavier than usual. And I know a lot of people say that, but I'm telling the truth here. The stench down there is always bad, but this was something else. Like rot mixed with sulfur. I tried to shake it off as just another nasty job, but Carl, who's normally all jokes and laughter, was unusually quiet as well. "You feel that?" he asked, his voice low, almost like he didn't want to say it out loud. "Yeah," I muttered, gripping the flashlight a little tighter. "Just the air, man. Let's get this done quick." We started making our way deeper into the tunnels, the sound of our boots sloshing through the murky water echoing off the walls. Our flashlights barely cut through the thick darkness, and every step seemed to take us further away from any sense of safety. After about a half an hour of walking, we came to the area that was flagged for flooding. Sure enough, water had backed up, almost knee-deep in some spots. I groaned, already dreading the amount of work we'd have to do to clear it out. I was about to reach for my tools when I heard it. It was a low growl. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I mean, the pipes down here make all sorts of noises. But then I saw Carl freeze. He heard it too. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Carl nodded, his eyes wide, scanning the darkness around us. "Probably just a dog or something," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "A dog? Down here?" Maybe a stray had gotten lost, but that growl, it didn't sound like any dog I'd ever heard. We stood there for a few seconds, listening, but the noise didn't come again. Finally, Carl shrugged and started wading through the water towards the clogged drain. "Let's just get this over with," he grumbled. I followed him, but the feeling in my gut was getting worse. Something was wrong. I could feel it. The hair in the back of my neck was standing on end, and my heart was pounding in my chest. We got to the drain, and Carl knelt down to start clearing it. I stood watch, shining my flashlight around, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. And that's when I saw something. Movement. Just beyond the edge of my light. I whipped the beam in that direction, but whatever it was had already slipped back into the shadows. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel my hands start to shake. "Carl," I whispered, Something's down here with us. Carl looked up at me, his face pale. What did you see? I don't know, I admitted, but it was big. Bigger than a dog. We both stood up, scanning the tunnel. The growl came again, louder this time, and it echoed all around us. My stomach dropped. That was no dog. That was something else. Something that didn't belong in the sewers, or anywhere for that matter. Carl swore under his breath and pulled out his own flashlight, shining into the darkness. That's when we saw it. 2 glowing yellow eyes staring back at us from about 20 feet away. They were low to the ground, but they were moving, fast. Run, Carl whispered, barely able to get the word out. I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted, splashing through the water as fast as we could, the sound of something massive crashing through the tunnels behind us. I didn't dare look back. I could hear it, its claws scraping against the concrete, its growl deep and terrifying. It sounded close. Too close. Come on, Carl shouted, his voice cracking with fear. We rounded a corner, and that's when I felt something swipe at my leg. I stumbled, but I managed to keep running. My leg was burning, but I didn't stop to check it. We had to get out of there. Up ahead, I could see the ladder leading back up to the street. Carl reached it first and scrambled up, his boots slipping on the wet rugs. I was right behind him, but just as I grabbed the ladder, I felt something cold and scaly wrap around my ankle, yanking me back. I screamed, kicking wildly, and managed to free myself, but not before I got a good look at it. The thing that grabbed me, it wasn't a dog, or a rat, or anything I'd ever seen before. It was like a big lizard, but not like any lizard from this world. It was massive, its body covered in slick black scales, its eyes glowing yellow with hunger, and its mouth, it was full of sharp, jagged teeth dripping with the sewer's filth. I climbed that ladder faster than I've ever moved in my life. Carl was already at the top, pulling the manhole cover back over into place as I hauled myself up. We collapsed on the street, gasping for breath, and the sounds of the city around us feeling like a distant dream. For a long time, neither of us said anything. We just sat there, shaking, covered in muck, trying to process what had just happened. Finally, Carl broke the silence. We can't tell anyone, he said, his voice hoarse. Who'd believe us? I replied, still staring at the manhole like the thing was about to come bursting out at us any second. We sat there for a while longer before we finally got up and made our way back to the truck. My leg was throbbing, and when I looked down, I saw 3 deep gashes where the thing had grabbed me. I didn't tell Carl, though. We just drove back to the station in silence. We never went back to that part of the sewers again, and to this day, I still have nightmares about those glowing yellow eyes. Whatever that thing was, it's still down there, lurking in the darkness, waiting. Now, I know you don't believe me, but I don't suggest you try to debunk this story. Some things might be better just left alone. The night started off like any other. Frank and I had been called to fix a telecommunications line that had gone down somewhere in the old, abandoned part of the city's sewer system. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? Just another job. Get in, find the damaged line, patch it up, and head home. That's what we thought, at least. You get used to the dark, damp tunnels, the smell of sewage, and the quiet hum of the city above. Frank was newer, but he was solid. Always cracked a joke, always had your back. We were a good team. But that night changed everything. The entrance to the sewer was just a manhole on a forgotten street, way on the edge of town. It was one of those places no one goes unless they have to. I remember feeling uneasy as we parked the van. Frank must have felt it too because, for once, he wasn't talking. Weird part of town, huh? Frank said, his voice low as we pulled the heavy manhole cover aside. Yeah, I muttered, trying to ignore the chill creeping up my spine. Let's get this over with. We climbed down the rusty ladder into the sewer, our flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The air down there was cold and damp, the walls slick with moisture. The smell was the worst part. As usual, rotting water, mildew, and God knows what else. Our radios crackled as we descended deeper, losing connection the further we went. I remember that detail clearly, the moment when the static finally overtook the voices on the other end. It was like we had crossed some invisible threshold, cut off from the world above. We walked for what felt like an hour, maybe more. The sewers down there were a maze, tunnels crisscrossing in all directions. The further we got, the older everything looked. The concrete walls were crumbling, the pipes rusted and leaking. It was as if we had stepped back in time. "This place is a dump," Frank said, kicking a pile of debris out of the way. "No wonder the line went down." I nodded, shining my light along the walls, looking for the break in the cable. And that's when we heard something. At first I thought it was just the wind, a faint sound, barely audible over the dripping of the water and the hum of the city's underbelly. But then it grew louder, clearer, a soft, melodic hum like someone singing. "You hear that?" I asked, stopping in my tracks. Frank frowned, turning his head to listen. "What, the water?" "No," I said, straining to hear it again. "Listen. Someone's singing." For a moment we stood there in the darkness, the sound of the song echoing through the tunnels. It was distant, but beautiful in a way that didn't make sense. It shouldn't have been beautiful down there. Nothing beautiful belongs in a place like that. Frank chuckled nervously. "You're hearing things, man. No one's down here but us." But the longer we stood there, the louder it got. A woman's voice, clear as day, echoing through the pipes. It was haunting, the kind of voice that crawled into your head and made you want to hear more. "I'm telling you, someone's down here," I insisted. My heart started to race. "We should check it out." Frank didn't argue, but I could tell he was spooked too. We started walking toward the sound, our flashlights bouncing off the wet walls. The song was leading us deeper, further into the old part of the sewer where no one had been in years. The air was getting colder, the darkness thicker. As we moved, the singing grew louder, more intense. The voice, it was hypnotic, drawing us in with every note. I could feel it pulling at me, tugging me forward, making it hard to think about anything else. Frank was quiet now, his face pale, his eyes wide. "We should turn back," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. But I couldn't. I didn't want to. The song, it was beautiful. I needed to see who was singing it. I needed to get closer. We turned a corner and that's when we saw her. She was sitting in the middle of the tunnel, perched on the edge of a broken pipe, her body half submerged in the foul, murky water. The woman was beautiful, almost too beautiful for the world. Her skin was pale, her hair long and dark, clinging to her body like it was made of water itself. And her eyes, they were large, dark, and deep. Too deep. It felt like if you looked into them for too long, you'd fall in and never come out. She was singing, her lips barely moving, the melody filling the air like a fog. And then she stopped, her head slowly turning towards us. For a second, none of us moved. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare at her. She was so perfect. Frank must have been feeling the same because he was frozen too, just standing there, staring at her like he was in a trance. And then she smiled. It was the kind of smile that shouldn't have existed. Not there, not in a place like that. It was too sharp, too wide. Her teeth, they weren't right. Too many of them, too pointed. It was like watching something wear a human face as a mask, but underneath it was something else entirely. Something monstrous. "Frank," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We need to go." But Frank didn't move. His eyes were locked onto her, and he took a step forward. "Frank!" I shouted, grabbing his arm. He shook me off, his eyes glazed over, like he wasn't even there anymore. He was moving toward her now, slowly, like he couldn't help himself, like he was being pulled in by the sound of her voice. I grabbed him again, harder this time, and pulled him back, but he was strong, stronger than he should have been. I need to hear her," he muttered, his voice distant, almost like he was dreaming. "I need to go to her." "No, you don't," I shouted, trying to drag him back, but he wasn't listening. He was slipping away from me, his eyes locked onto hers. And then she moved. Her body slid forward, unnaturally smooth, like she was gliding across the water. Her smile widened, her dark eyes flashing with something hungry, something ancient. She reached out toward Frank, her fingers long and thin, her nails like claws. "Frank, snap out of it," I screamed, pulling him as hard as I could. But it was too late. She had him. Her hand latched onto his wrist, and in one swift motion she pulled him into the water. I'll never forget the sound he made, the scream that was cut short as he disappeared beneath the surface. The water churned, dark and thick, and then silence. I stood there frozen, staring at the spot where Frank had been. The woman, the thing, looked up at me, her eyes glowing in the darkness, her smile fading into something much darker, much more dangerous. She started to sing again, her voice softer now, beckoning me closer. But I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were rooted to the spot, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refusing to obey. The song wrapped around me, pulling me toward her, drawing me closer to the water's edge. I was about to step forward when I saw it. Frank's face, just beneath the surface. His eyes were wide, his mouth wide open in a silent scream, his hand reaching out toward me. That broke the spell. I turned and ran. I don't know how I made it back, but I did. I ran through the tunnels, my flashlight bouncing wildly, my heart racing in my chest. I could hear the song behind me, echoing through the pipes, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I knew her song would entrance me again. When I finally burst out of the manhole into the cold night air, I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath. The city around me was quiet, the streets flickering lights overhead. I was alone, and Frank was gone. I never went back to that part of the city. I never told anyone what really happened. But I know she's still down there waiting, singing her song. And if you ever find yourself working near the old sewer system and you hear something faint, something that sounds like a voice calling out to you, don't follow it. Run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. Because once you hear her song, she never lets you leave. The shadows have retreated, for now. But remember, the darkness is never far away. What hides beneath our world waits for the next moment to strike, and the next victim to pull into its cold embrace. Thank you for joining us on Midnight Delight, where the darkness is always just a flicker away. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling tales. Sleep well, if you can.